I wanted to talk to Rod because I mentioned this term that was coined by someone at IBM, systems of interaction. And that was sort of one of those key mind maps that got me going on this notion of how what we're really reinventing here are processes in the real world.
Well, and it comes out especially as you look, as you mentioned, all the new applications that people are trying to put together today. And we've got, as everybody in this room has, systems of record, data systems, and how big enterprises work. But the new applications are, Internet of Things, but they have to be thinking about not only the human interaction, but how are they going to interact with other systems, as you said. Interoperability, how do they integrate? How do they work together? And thinking about it in that kind of holistic manner.
Yeah.
The interesting part, too, is, and many for the audience, the customers that you'll deal with today and that we'll see in the future are business people that are looking for opportunities, not necessarily the technologist.
That's
so
right.
it's the very contextual from a domain expert standpoint.
Yeah. Well, there's also kind of this very interesting thing, that's so important about the internet that I think is even more so now, which is the notion that you're connecting things that are potentially seriously dissimilar. So a good example, I think about the company Climate Corp, which was recently acquired by Monsanto. I went to meet recently with David Friedberg, the founder and CEO, and he now at Monsanto is in charge of another company they acquired called Precision Planting. So that's their robotic, seed planting, software, which sort of figures out, okay, how wet is the soil? How much pressure should you put on the thing which is inserting the seeds, which is using the seed more efficiently than the old method of just spraying it out, right? They're like boom, 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 injecting the seed into the soil, and you kind of go, wow, here's this really interesting thing. You got all this data from sensors collected into this data-driven application, which is then now driving, robotic tractors, and that's going to be the pattern, where we have these very dissimilar things, or it seemed dissimilar, that are suddenly going to be working together.
Well, and the part of that, as you just said, it's all data-driven. And what I haven't heard a lot at the conference is that feedback loop. I'm collecting data as I'm inserting seed at certain levels. How does the farmer get involved in what's working with that? They've worked the land, they're big farms, and when they harvest it. So John Deere, farming's kind of a passion for me. John Deere has equipment that, as you're pulling wheat in, it can do the analysis, decide whether it should go as grain for cattle, or does it go to the wheat for making bread. And those things, I think, have to come together. And as you and I've talked about, it's the person who is the farmer that wants to be more intelligent about how they're utilizing seed and land and weather, not to have it taken away from them.
Yeah, and I think that's just, it goes back to this phrase that I like to use a lot. This is actually about human augmentation.
Yes.
It's about making us smarter and more capable.
Yes.
And that can be as simple as, whoa, I can ride this skateboard that is sort of self-powered and, kind of just reacts to my balance. How cool is that? That's an augmentation. It can be an augmentation that says, oh my God, I have these skills that used to belong only to homing pigeons, where I can know exactly where I am and how to get to anywhere. Or it can be, I can talk to a device and it can listen to me, or it can be,
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things we learned is, we talked about the systems of interaction, is when we started down this path with Watson, my team did the first tablet prototype showing Watson to doctors at a conference, HIMSS conference. And the person was a designer, put up the iPad and said, here's what we're going to show you. And the discussion stopped for him talking. He opened up and the doctor said, well, here's what we want. We want to interact with the data, we want to interact with the customer or the patient, and then at some point we want to be able to use Watson a little smarter. But we don't want it interfering with our relationship. And that was insightful for them to tell us, but it also gave us the more of this is, you think about farmers, you think about other things, these interactions you have to collect a lot to be able to understand how people really want to work with their devices.
Right, and it's sort of interesting, talking about hospitals. I was just talking with an operating room nurse the other day, and she was just talking about how much of their work is record keeping.
Yep.
And you start thinking about the other side of how do we get, she said, and so there's this new move for sort of like you have retired nurses who are now actually just taking the record, taking the notes, so that the actual nurses can be paying attention to the patient, and you kind of go, well, that's actually probably a good job for computers as they get better at paying attention to some of these things. But I want to talk a little bit also about another big IBM theme, which is smart cities. One of the things to me that's interesting about cities is that they're messy, and they're bottom up, and they're organic. And a lot of the visions of smart cities seem to be, of the guy in the central control room who's kind of got everything nailed. And how do you reconcile those two visions of the smart city? One in which it's just like, hey, there's a bunch of, in the same way that cities have always been, organic, but now they're organic with people with devices that are throwing off data, and there's all this sensor data coming in. And how do we make that more meaningful and useful versus somehow that this is sort of this pristine managed environment?
Well, there is no pristine managed environment. I mean, anybody who thinks about governments and agencies, and they all like to work independently at this. But as we see sensors start to roll in, then people start to look at the data and say, well, how do we reuse part of this? What's valuable for different different departments. And it's available now, so the barriers to doing that are much less than we've had before on this. So part of the smarter cities piece is many times talking with the, staying away from kind of the pristine, let's look at it from an IT perspective, but going to the department saying, so what are you trying to accomplish with your water systems? Is it leaks? Is it fire hydrant replacement? What is it exactly?
That kind of brings up another thing. I mean, there obviously are a lot of areas where replacing the infrastructure is really going to matter. Water being a great example. We have a water crisis coming. And conservation is going to be a huge part of that. And conservation doesn't just mean people, not hosing down their front, sidewalk. It also does mean dealing with those leaks. We're going to have to replace a lot of infrastructure. But what we put in has to also be robust and long-lasting and upgradable. And when you're putting sensors in the pipes, how do you do it in such a way that that isn't going to be, oops, we made the wrong technology decision, we got to dig them up?
One is a fair question. And the part that I think that we've learned, and I think from business, looking from the internet, things do have to be very loosely coupled. You can't have everything very tightly coupled because, like you said, new equipment comes along, new sensors come along. How do I replace what I've got on this? And as your point, part of this replaceability is to be factored in. So, like you mentioned, I've got sprinkler systems, and the new ones I'm looking at will test the moisture in the soil to decide whether they should turn on or not. But I also want them, because it'll be on my internet, to notify me. Tell me what's going on. I need to know that. And that's part of the human part of this.
That's right, the soil is dry, but it's going to rain later this afternoon.
I might know that.
Exactly.
It doesn't know. And so departments want that same thing. Back to your point of augmentation, a department head says, gee, looks like we've got sensors telling us some things. What else is going on that I should be aware of? What other things? It's not just the sensor reading in a piece of data and you go, oh my God, there's a leak over here. What other variables are going to factor in? So it's back to the the person who's the expert that can look and say, well, maybe we should look at this other information as well.
Right. Although it is also, as you said, there's sort of this interesting mix of sensors and then actuators to do things autonomously. At the same time, you do figure out where's the person in that loop because they may have different objectives.
Well, and like you said, to your point is that I'm in Atlanta, so I'd like the water company to give me feedback on what I'm using. And as I look at my sensors, I'd like that to factor into this.
So let me talk about something else that's related to that. Let's imagine that we have smart water infrastructure. And Jerry Brown says, there's a drought, and we're going to turn your water down by 60%, as opposed to, we would like you to reduce your usage by 60%. Are there kind of, issues now we worry about internet privacy. Are we going to be worried in the future about, internet water rationing or?
I don't know. But I do things where I opt in to energy saving, so I see brownouts come through. But I get a phone call, and before they do it, some voice will come in and say, we're going to do a brownout from 2 to 4 p.m. If you don't want to participate, press a button. And
so there is starting to be some practice in all these areas. And it highlights this notion that we actually have to start thinking about what are some of the policies that we're going to put in place around this new technology, as opposed to just, hey, we're just going to deploy it.
Correct.
And some company will decide what the rules are.
I think that's I think it's a big part of it that says, just like the internet, when we purchase online, we get an email, we get some notification almost immediately. When I see Internet of Things and devices, how do you notify people? How do you tell them what's going on? And that's why I think things like if this then that become real popular on linking things together, being able to put recipes in place that can help you be able to
and there's also
be more intelligent.
That ability for the device to say, hey, I want to interrupt you. One of the things, I don't know how many people have actually ever tried the Moto X. It's my favorite phone ever. It does things like it notices that you're driving because it feels the vibration and notices the movement and so on. And then it says, it'll just suddenly wake up and say, you just got a text. Would you like me to read it to you? And I love that. And I go, that's actually a fantastic, advance where the device actually politely interrupts and says, I got something, and of course you can control that, what things it'll interrupt you with.
But you can think about, as I look at cars, and as you pointed out, what's a smart car versus a dumb car. But we'll have devices in cars that can do monitoring of your health.
Sure.
And that's a good thing.
And it's amazing things they can do with computer vision. There was an app I saw 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was probably too early, but looking for drowsiness in drivers.
That's right.
And
well, and then back to system interaction. That's information that then comes into an insurance company or comes into other people. That how do you react to those things? And I also back to the point of you opt into these things, but it's all connected.
Speaking of insurance, in the way that advertising was the sort of the native. It turned out to be the native business model for the internet. I think insurance is going to be the native business model for the Internet of Things.
I think it is.
and in some way that we're going to see all kinds of startups who are monetized through various kinds of insurance. Or insurance savings or,
well, if you look at the fact if you can drive safer, you see the rates changing now. But boy, if Ford Motors has all these sensors in the car that can tell you about lanes.
Well, the thing about, Climate Corp was fundamentally selling weather insurance. And the more data allows things to become more predictable, it changes the dynamics of that entire industry and that entire business model. Hey, I want to switch tracks here for a minute. We originally met in the context of open source. Let's talk about open source hardware and how important you think it is for the future of what we're all working on here.
A number of aspects. One is that I think it's one of the most important dimensions as you start looking at people who are extremely inventive, medical devices. Most of the medical devices that become useful in surgeries and others are designed by doctors. Right? So. But there's hurdles to do that. Someone has to make sure that they've got the prototypes and manufacturers work them. So the more we can see that open, there's more innovation that can be touched by the experts to use it. I think it's great.
And are you familiar with Jose Gomez Marquez's Maker Nurse program?
No.
He's putting in, it's an experimental program. I think it's funded by Robert Wood Johnson. Where they're putting maker spaces into hospitals for the nurses to be able to, because they're always, having to cobble stuff together. Super cool idea.
Well, it's the same thing like, I've donated to a number of things on prosthetics. The idea that kids that have prosthetics grow and they change, and those have been very expensive, and now you're seeing all that change, that people can design things as they grow up. Those are brilliant, and the cost of doing that needs to be continued, driven down, because it's the hardware and software that you want to be able to drive, that faster type of innovation with. So I think it's great that we think about open source software, and
Yeah.
people thought, you guys are crazy. Now, how do we do it from a hardware perspective? And then it gives designers and others much more opportunity early on to
Yeah.
start to shape these types of solutions.
So let's go to a little bit to IBM. IBM is sort of the original great company in the computing space. You're still a really important company. But you've gone through a number of transformations over the years. What's this next transformation going to do to IBM?
Well, if I knew that, then I'd invest accordingly. Right now, as probably a lot of folks have seen, cloud computing is becoming a big factor for all businesses. But I think beyond cloud computing, it's these new workloads. And from an IBM perspective, we're seeing that our customers changing. It's not just the IT professional or the CIO, it's the CMO, the CFO. It's people who are in this audience that are tech savvy, but also business savvy as well. And so from an IBM perspective, we're looking at expanding the types of customers we touch. And
Right.
how do we do that better? And how
Yeah.
do we create systems faster? This whole DevOps is really about continuous business delivery. How do we do that? How do we help our customers do that? And there's a number of customers I've talked to that, in close design that said, well, gee, it takes us 6 to 9 months to kind of figure out how we bring things to market. Maybe we do it more socially, but if we do that, then my supply chain, everything has to be within days or hours to have a unique value proposition.
Just so you know, another one of the OATV portfolio companies, Beta Brands, has been doing both of those things. Crowdsourcing designs and local manufacturing for that very reason.
And that's an important factor.
Yeah.
And so as businesses look to change their business models, and I think that's the biggest factor for us,
Yeah.
is how do we stay relevant and essential as business models change? And as we're doing things with Watts and others, we're putting some pretty good sized bets on the line to go do that.
Yeah. One of the challenges, obviously, for big companies, and it's really interesting because I think it's a challenge, for big companies now like Google, is how do you place small bets that are going to turn into big markets? And one of the best ways that I've always seen to do that is to, follow the enthusiasts. It's kind of like what led us here to Solid, which is this new entrepreneurial ecosystem, was of course the maker movement, which was the movement of enthusiasts who were saying, there's some really cool stuff happening in hardware, you got to be there. And we launched Maker Faire in 2004, if I recall, or maybe it was 2005. Make Magazine, take it back. Make Magazine, we started in 2004, came out in 2005. Maker Faire was 2006. But that's now 8 years ago. And only now, in the last couple of years have we seen the entrepreneurial explosion. And we have this notion that all this starts with entrepreneurs.
Yep.
And my sense is so many of the things that I've been around, from World Wide Web to the open source software movement to the maker movement, have all been started with actually people who were just out there having fun. And
I think that that's moving now. It used to be that the barriers to do that in businesses, in our business and others, were high. Getting to the right computing power, getting to the right data. Right now, it's people in the business units that can do it themselves.
Yeah.
And so innovation, I think, for an IBM or other companies is back to relationships. You and I have had one for a long time. What's going on? What are you doing? Talk to me about what you're thinking about and what hurts your head, not what you're doing today.
Yeah.
And have those relationships, because the innovation you're going to find is someone saying, we've just done this really cool thing that we don't know quite what to do with, but and it won't be in the places that you thought it was.
Right, and I think that really highlights, is probably a great place to close, it highlights one of the really magical things that's happening right now. The most interesting, productive conversations are conversations between people from different worlds.
Yes.
And the conversation that is starting to happen between hardware and software and biology, between manufacturing and business models and advertising, is like there's this amazing stew of conversations happening right now, as we really are, I think, the next truly transformative period in the history of technology.
Totally agree.
All right. Thanks very much for joining me here.
Appreciate it. Thank you.